Chapter 41. No One Left But God. The jay broke the morning. The blue jay shocked it with yelling, streaking the woods, startling animals, causing a sour consternation, then hopping the hemlock as though hens should be as wakeful as he, and should move. He yelled, "I saw him!" He squawked with egregious self-importance. "Me! I'm the one! I saw him first! The rooster's coming! Ha!" Pertolote's breathing stopped. Her emotions were huge and had no words. She wanted with all her heart to run, and at the same time to hide because she was so frightened. She walked. She walked through the camp, seeing not another animal, and she did not notice that they crept into line behind her, and that soon she was the point of a whole procession, flattening the snow in perfect silence. She took the higher ground north of the hemlock. It was an unconscious eye that followed the jay's flight. Her conscious eye kept scanning the white horizon, seeking a traveler, and who would he be when she saw him? But wouldn't he be Chanticleer, her husband? Why should she even wonder? Too soon, there he was, standing alone like a nomad in the wilderness of snow. By an effort she did not pause, but continued toward him, and he watched her coming. Pertolote went to meet a mystery, with her heart in her throat. "Oh, Chanticleer, Chanticleer, what happened to you?" His comb hung slug-like and blackened on one side of his head, and when she could see them, his eyes appeared raw. His body was thin and yellowed from a very long labor. One claw was raised as though in pain, its toes thick and gnarled, and he was gazing at her so steadily that she flinched, and she did stop, 3 feet before him. The woman said, abashed, "Hello?" The rooster did not answer, as though considering her greeting. Pertolote felt guilty at her hesitation. How much he must have suffered! She called on all the love that dwelt in her for this husband of hers, and in a rush of affection she said, "Chanticleer, you're home again. You came home after all." Impulsively she moved to him, to kiss him, but he stood stock still. "I did something, Pertolote," he said, his voice as bloodless as the snow. So she didn't kiss him, though the need to trembled in her. Tenderly she said, "Was it a good something?" And she said, "Are you glad?" How hard he scrutinized her. She dropped her eyes. "Not much of a something," he said. "Better than nothing," he said. But he made no move to unveil before her the north, the past, the truth of his excursion, himself. He was sealed in a solitude as hard as ice. "Well," she said. She tried to smile for him, though it faltered. This was like a meeting between strangers, and an examination too cruel, since she didn't know its purpose. And besides, wasn't he Chanticleer? And wasn't he her husband? "Well," she offered the smile, "what did you do, then?" Immediately the rooster said, "I brought him home again. What do you think of that?" Pertolote whispered, "Him? Who?" "This is very, very important," said Chanticleer intently. "You must see the importance of this." Pertolote nodded. It was obvious that something consumed him. Even in ignorance, because she loved him, she said, "I do, Chanticleer. Who?" His eye took light. "Mundocani," he said. "You—" Pertolote returned the gaze, astonished and feeling a prickle of hope. "You brought Mundocani with you? You found him, Chanticleer?" "Yes," he said. "Where?" "Right here." The cock moved. He bent, and with that poor crashed head of his, he began mightily to thrust in snow. He scraped snow with his claws and threw the snow aside. He swept it with his wings, and there appeared between them, grinning, its eye sockets hollowed, a skull. In spite of herself, Pertolote gasped. But now the rooster fairly rammed his face to hers. "This is so important, Perlote. Don't say no. Don't make light of it. Don't be afraid. I am not mad. He is dead. I know he's dead. And what's this? His skull. That's all. It's only his skull, and I know this, too, that he died in the war. He's been dead a long time, but I am going to bury him, Perlote, and all the animals will mourn him according to every propriety under the sun, and that is not wrong, it is not foolish, it is not nothing, it is right." He paused, panting, glaring at her. "What do you think of that?" he said. And he waited for her answer. Perlote was dizzy with confusion. It was Mundocani, and something of sorrow lurked in her to see his head all stuffed with snow, and it was not wrong to bury a friend, but it was strange, all out of proportion, yet it was his desire, and he was her husband. This was Chanticleer before her, crying her approval. She said, "He was in the netherworld?" "Yes," he said. "So you truly went down below the earth? You, Chanticleer?" "Yes," he said. She was trying to find some premise, some rational footing for herself. It was as though she were digging in snow. "Worm was there?" "Yes." "You saw Worm?" "Yes." And Worm is dead?" "Yes," he cried. "Yes, yes, yes." "And this is the something you did?" "Perlote," he cried straight into her face, "you're avoiding the question. Do you see the importance of burying the dog with ceremony? Do you?" She felt so beaten. She whispered, "Of course I do." "You do?" Yes, I do." He broke into a magnificent grin and roared, "I knew you would! And no one is wiser than Perlote." There was for her a thrill in his enthusiasm. So then, all she had to do was agree with his convictions. "But is that all?" she said. "The animals are suffering some memory. Black pale." "Perlote!" roared her husband, in a sudden high good humor. "That's all there needs to be." Then he bethought himself. Oh, look at me, he clucked, struggling for calm. "I'm forgetting the little things. Ha ha! I'm forgetting to hug my wife, now that I'm home again. Perlote, can I kiss you?" The rooster was a whirlwind, but a kiss would be a good thing. It could be a starting place, and he was her husband. Perlote tried the smile again, and she said, "Yes." He brought his face towards her in gentleness, but in the instant before she closed her eyes, she saw a worm slide from his nostril, thin, wavering, and green. In horror, she watched while it twisted on itself, and then another dribbled from his ear, and she shrank backward, wailing, "Chanticleer!" "What?" Immediately he stiffened again into his suspicions, glaring at her. She couldn't take the revulsion out of her face. She felt like vomiting. His very feathers rippled with the motion of a myriad of living worms. "You," she gagged, "you're... oh, Chanticleer." What? I'm what? I wanted to kiss my wife. What? What's that?" "I can't kiss you," she whined the truth. Sickened, Perlote turned away. At once she saw that they were not alone, that animals stood in silent ranks behind them, back to the woods, watching, and all of it was on a stage. In public, she was rejecting her husband. Perlote felt so wretched. She turned back to find his gaze hard, cold, and frozen again. In the time of her turning twice, there had come a world between them, a gaping universe. "But I do love you," she cried. What was she to do? "So," said the cock, "she loves me. So, then let her help me. Let her assist me with this one important thing, and then I'll trouble her no more. Take the front end of the skull," he commanded. Abjectly, Perlote went to the head of Mundocani, and with a shiver, gripped the hollow of his nose. She made ready to pull. her own head bowed. The rooster watched her, unmoving. Then he accused her. "You think that I am guilty, don't you? With all of these creatures here, you think that it's my fault, don't you? They talk of lives and murders and mothers and children. They seek a scapegoat, and it's me. And you believe them, don't you?" What could she say? She didn't understand a word of this. Without so much as raising her head, she said, "I don't." And then she felt a brutal thrust into her stomach. The cock had taken his place behind the skull and had driven it forward. "Pull!" he hissed. She pulled, though she had no wind. He pushed. The animals fell away from them and made a path, a sort of aisle, a ceremonial double file for the husband and his wife, and the skull between. This, then, was the homecoming of Chanticleer the rooster. "Pull!" he hissed. She pulled, unable to look at anyone, and he pushed. "See," sang the worms in the rooster's ear. "Do you see how they look at you?" Chanticleer answered nothing. "And she above them all," sang the worms. "Did you see the loathing in her face?" Chanticleer drove the dog's skull forward with power, answering nothing. "It's a conspiracy, cock," they sang. "There's none of them does not blame you. Murders and mothers and children, these at the center of false promises. And here is something to consider, that when you are no longer lovely, you can't be loved again. Do you truly think that you are lovely, cock?" So sang the worms through the whole complexity of the rooster's being. But he gave all his attention to the one precious thing in his life. He spent his strength on Mundocani's skull, forcing it toward its burial. Chanticleer was home again. Chapter 42. And then it was a pity. That same night, Chalcedony the crippled hen heard the rooster's compline and knew he had returned. She was by the stag and Delacour, the child now of her heart. They stood their huddled watch on the lower Liverbrook, at the southern edge of the animals' encampment. She couldn't leave them. She heard the compline and was not comforted, because it seemed a foreign note against her ear, and it did not name her name. It did not recognize the distress of Blackpale, whose breathing humped his entire body, and it did not silence the wolves. All that night the wolves prowled the darkness, calling bodiless to one another in falsetto howling, far in the north, from the western and eastern regions, and then so close, in the wood beside her, that she rose to her claws in defense. Not comforted. Chalcedony felt besieged and naked. She had a child to save, and that child had a father failing. They were a pitiful three against the darkness and the wolves and the wind. In that same night the wind arose with a finer fury, and then it seemed that all the forces had combined to terrify a hen. The wind sprayed snow crystals like arrows. No, not comforted. The poor hen didn't sleep at all, nor did she tuck her head beneath her wing. She watched with her eye wide open to the darkness. She watched on the windward side of the stag as though she might protect him. She listened to the howling and she watched. And then it was a pity, come the morning light, when the hen found that she was blinded on one side. The wind had frozen her bare right eyeball as hard as a marble. Here ends the fourth part of the book exactly writ. Libera me, Domine, de morte aeterna, in die illa tremenda, quando caeli movendi sunt et terra, dum veneris judicare saeculum per ignem. Part 5. The Son of Righteousness with Healing in his Wings. Chapter 43. Bereaved. There was a day when Ferric talked a continual frenetic pattern to the brown bird while pacing outside the den on the canyon stream that finally had turned to ice with the rest of creation. From morning to night he chattered and laughed and wept with himself, back and forth, pausing only for the new thought, the next memory to rush in, and then spilling that one too. He told her how he had met Rachel. He complained of Rachel's carelessness, then caught himself and apologized, and cried a while, and praised her openness to all the world. He described how they had come to the canyon and remembered aloud his hesitations. He talked at interminable length of the wonder of her pregnancy and of her perpetual peace, her smile. He begged the bird to believe that he had laughed once, he had done the right thing once, and he demanded whether she didn't think that Rachel was glad that he had laughed, and whether he hadn't done one thing right by her, and surely Rachel had noticed, hadn't she? And she loved him, didn't she? And oh, could she tell stories! And what a tenderness she had with children! She knew their ways by a merciful instinct. And had he told the bird about her smile, that Rachel had perfect teeth in a slender snout, and a smile that could make him cry? And then he said, "Why did she have to die?" He pressed his head to the canyon wall then, and drew his lips back from his teeth, and suffered a speechless pain. Let no one think it was merely emotional. This was physical pain in the pit of his stomach, and he couldn't breathe, and he couldn't talk any more. He slumped to the ground with his paws against his gut, and his tail and his legs jammed in. He had talked himself to the point of her death, and her death had entered into him, a hard reality. He had chattered the whole day through, but he hadn't fed his children. There was a day when Ferric lay in the den in hopeless silence. If he had slept the night before, then he woke without moving a muscle. He had merely passed into consciousness. His eyes opened, that was all. And the morning, the afternoon, and the evening all found him in exactly the same position. If he had not slept the night before, then it was uncommonly long that he could lie inert, and his despair was unimaginable. The women whispered. The women, a bird and 2 daughter coyotes, went about with a hushed fear, avoiding him. Neither did they eat. He hadn't fed them. There was a day when Ferric prayed. He stood at the lip of the canyon, wailing unto God the misery of the whole world and the grayness of it. His head was tipped to high heaven, somewhere on the far side of the cloud, and he asked whether God punished the wicked. Do ye? Whether the proud are ever brought down, whether the heartless ever know what they have done, and do they sting for their sins? Do they wish they hadn't done them? He wailed, "I know she isn't coming back. I know the forever of it. I know the body frozen in the grave. It's not her. But what can pay me for it? Do you comfort the little creatures? Tell me the reason. Maybe the reason can comfort me. Oh, oh." In all these days the bird and his daughters feared for him, because it seemed that he was close to dying himself. He had always been so frightened, so craven. This was a change, as though something had burst inside of him. He had always said "Tssst" as his sharpest comment. Now he was reckless. Now he uttered whatever came to his mind. Ferric Coyote was at the extremity, bereft of a wife and a son, talking or lying or crying to God. Even in his sleep he moaned, "Benoni." But in all these days he did not feed his children, and they were sickening. Hopsacking sighed often, though she did not tell her papa. Her nose dried and began to crack. It made little prints of blood when she touched it to the snow. Her eyes ran a yellow rheum which crusted on the lids and blurred her vision. But she didn't tell her papa because he was sad, and she was past the aching for food, and her tail was a miserable string. She was the first to lie down and not think about getting up. This was probably the way of things now, for both her mamma and her papa to go away, but in different ways. Soon she wouldn't mind at all any more.
"Papa, Hopsacking sleeping."
Ferric rolled his eyes from his sorrow and saw Twill. He said, "Good," and closed his eyes again.
"Papa,"
Twill nudged him again under the chin, lifting his head.
"Hopsacking sleeping."
"It's good," said Ferric, without opening his eyes. "Let her sleep."
"No, Papa."
The pup was urgent.
"But she's sleeping. She slept last night, and she slept yesterday. She never waked up to talk to me, but we always talked, Papa, but she didn't. Hopsacking's gone to sleep, but I want her to talk with me. What do we do?"
Ferric tried to bring his attention to the child. There was a close smell in the den and heaviness in his limbs. He was so empty and so tired.
"No one else talks to me, Papa. Just Hopsacking since Mama—"
She broke off, confused. Some subjects were taboo.
"Well, but you always looked at Benoni, and now you think about Benoni, but there's only just Hopsacking for me and me for Hopsacking, and she told me she was hungry, and then she went to sleep, Papa. Wake her up. Please just wake her up, and I'll let you be. I'll go away again. It's okay. You need to think about Mama. It's okay, but I need Hopsacking now."
Ferric felt the insistent nudging of his daughter. His daughter. He had a daughter, and she had a brave little nose. For a moment the very touch of her caused contentment in his soul, because there was a piece of family left, and if a piece, then a family still. Well, this was a kindness he hadn't noticed lately, and Twill had spirit in her, and wasn't that like Rachel? She was the daughter of Rachel, too. Suddenly this meant very much to Ferric, that Rachel walked in her children, and if he looked into her daughter's eyes, he could find her there. So was she gone? He put out his paw and laid it on Twill's back. Like a waking convalescent, he smiled on her, groggily. But she said,
"Papa!"
She was not smiling. She was grim.
"Hopsacking's sleeping. She said she was hungry and then she went to sleep."
A thought gathered in Ferric's mind, like a tiny cloud. Then it swelled, and then it stormed in him. Hungry? He rose and turned to the other child, surprised at how close to him she lay. He called her name. He slid his snout under her and lifted, but she was loose sticks. She flopped down again. She was light and so sinfully thin. Her mouth sagged open and her tongue lolled out. She made no complaint.
"Hopsacking!"
Rachel had named her. Oh, God, how could he take the name away again?
"Hopsacking!"
It was the protruding tongue that broke him. This was like Benoni's tongue. Here it was, all over again, but he couldn't rage against the wicked now, because he was the wicked. How long had it been since he'd brought his daughter food?
"Hopsacking! Please, please, wake up!"
Her tiny breath smelled like decay. This was the death scent. Why hadn't he gone to bring her food? She didn't wake up. Well, he didn't have to eat. He deserved not to eat, but the child was innocent and should have eaten. She didn't wake up. So what were the reasons then? And why did some of the creatures die? On account of other creatures, like himself. Don't ask God why, you know why, but she wasn't waking up.
"Rachel, I'm sorry,"
cried the poor coyote, trembling and dizzy, and half of that was emotion, but half was his own malnourishment, because neither had he eaten. They were a den of starving souls. Now, under the effort, he felt what pitiful strength he had, and he nearly swooned. Oh, what a condition he'd allowed them to come to. He could hardly walk straight. Twill's eyes were big, watching him. He bumped her, leaving the den. He thought, "I'll get some food." He climbed the great stairs, but stumbled and slipped down. All of his limbs were rubber. So what then? Were they all going to perish in the end? Why hadn't he gotten food when he was able? One by one he took the stairs again. But who could find food in this damnable winter? Where did he think he was going? He had daughters. He had daughters. How cruel of him to neglect his daughters. Ferric, don't look for murderers anywhere else. At the rim of the canyon, he heard the panicky whine of Twill below.
"Papa, can I go with you?"
He looked down and saw her tiny frame. Perhaps he said no because she cried,
"But are you coming back this time?"
That undid him. Go. Should he go? When did going ever benefit his children? Stay? Should he stay? But then they might as well lay down and die. And who would talk with Twill then? And did she think he was running away from them?
"Oh, Rachel," he wailed. "Oh, Rachel, what am I going to do? I need you."
He turned to the forest, and there, bulking between the pine and himself, was a dun cow walking toward him. He saw her mortal eye under one horn only, and he fainted.